Okay, so the heart chambers, we have the atrium, the ventricles. The atrium they're receiving blood. So they're receiving blood from the body, or it's receiving blood from the lungs. So the right atrium there's 3 major openings in the right atrium. It's receiving blood from the body. So there's the superior vena cava, which is coming from the top side. Inferior vena cava is coming from the inferior side. And then the coronary sinus. Remember when we looked at the coronary circulation, there was that large round thing on the back side of the heart that opens into the right atrium and brings in the deoxygenated blood. Left atrium receives blood from the pulmonary veins, and there's 4 openings there. They're actually a little smaller than the ventricles. And then there's an interatrial septum, which is a wall that's between the 2 atria, separating the 2 atrium. It contains a depression because as a fetus, before the fetus is born, then there is an opening actually between the 2 atria because they aren't breathing, they don't have to have any of the pulmonary circulation, so the blood can go straight between the 2 atria since there's no breathing or anything that occurs there in the lungs. Then the ventricles, there's an atrioventricle canal which opens between the atrium and the ventricle. And there's a right ventricle, which then opens to the pulmonary trunk. So the right ventricle is going to pump the blood from the heart to the pulmonary trunks out to the lungs. And then the left ventricle is going to pump the blood to the aorta, which goes to the rest of the body. And there's an interventricular septum that separates the 2 there. Okay, and what keeps the blood from going backwards from when the ventricles contract, what keeps the blood from going back into the atria instead of going out through the vessels are these valves. So we have some different valves that we need to talk about. The atrioventricular valve, they're called AV valves, and they are between the atrium and the ventricle. They are leaf-like cusps that are attached to cone-shaped papillary muscles by tendons. So you can kind of see in this picture up here, there's these little cusps that are closing, and then these are the tendons. They're called chordae tendineae that are attaching to these papillary muscles down on the muscular wall. The right, so here's the right valve. It has 3 cusps, so it's called a tricuspid valve. This valve on the left, or on the right, no, the left valve, right, is the bicuspid. It also is sometimes called the mitral valve. So the bicuspid and the tricuspid valve. When the valves are open, that means the atrioventricular canal is open, and blood can go from the atrium into the ventricle. Once the ventricle starts to contract, that valve closes so that the blood can't go back up to there. Okay. Semilunar valves are what are separating the ventricle from the vessels that the blood is leaving the ventricles from. So on the right side, since the right ventricle is pumping out to the pulmonary arteries, it's called the pulmonary valve, the pulmonary semilunar valve. And the left one, since it's going into the aorta, is called the aortic semilunar valve. It's a name based on what vessel it's opening up to. Each cusp is shaped like a cup, and when the cusps are filled, the valves are closed, and when the cusps are emptied, the valves open. So these are showing those 2 valves, the bottom picture. Whoa. Oops. Okay, this is just a bigger picture of this. We have the left atrium. This would be the bicuspid valve. Left atrium to the left ventricle. It's receiving the blood from the pulmonary veins. And then it's going through the aorta to the aortic semilunar valve. So this is just the left ventricle. No. It is a sagittal view. So this would be like the left side, because this is just the left ventricle, left atrium. So the blood's coming in from the pulmonary veins to the left atrium, going through the bicuspid valve, and then it will be pushed out through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. Here's the right ventricle. And so the right ventricle, they are you can't even really, the left atrium, here we go. No, this is still the left. Okay, I see what this picture is. This is when the blood is, and the ventricle is contracting, so it's pushing the blood up. It's showing how the blood can't get back up into the left atrium. It's going to have to go through the aortic semilunar valve. So this is when the ventricle is relaxed. The blood would be filling up in the atrium, and it's coming down into the ventricle. And then when the ventricle contracts, that closes this valve and causes the blood to go through the aortic semilunar valve. So here's the blood flow through the heart. So their number one is on the right atrium. So if the blood is in the right atrium, it's going to go through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. The right ventricle, then when the ventricle contracts, it's going to push the blood into the pulmonary semilunar valve. So here's the right atrium. It's going through this tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. When it contracts, the blood will go from the right ventricle through the pulmonary semilunar valve here into the pulmonary arteries. And which I guess they call this the pulmonary trunk, and then the arteries are what branches. Goes to the lungs, gets oxygen. When it comes back, it's going to come back into the left ventricle through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, goes through the bicuspid valve right here into the left ventricle, and then it's going to go through up here the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta and go to the rest of the body. This is a good picture, yeah. When it comes back from the body, it's going to come back through either the superior vena cava or the inferior vena cava right here into the right atrium, and then go back through that whole process again, going through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle, pulmonary semilunar valve to the pulmonary arteries to the lungs, back into the left atrium, through the tricuspid valve, or the bicuspid valve, left ventricle, aortic semilunar valve to the aorta to the rest of the body, and then back around.
So then, basically that's the picture we need.
That is a good picture, yep.
So when the blood flow starts, does it start in the tricuspid?
Oh.
Does it start by...
I guess I'm
the right atrium first?
Oh, you could start anywhere. I mean, it's not like the blood isn't formed there, so it,
So
you know,
the
it,
blood can start wherever.
yeah. Because you have blood all over. Yeah, it could start anywhere.
Has to start in the
But
blue areas.
for-
That's the only place it can start, right? The blue areas.
No. No. But for our list for your assignment on Friday, I want you to start at the lungs, right? And then list where it goes.
Where are the lungs at?
The pulmonary arteries go to the lungs. Oops. Okay, the heart skeleton consists of a plate of fibrous connective tissue between the aorta and ventricles. And there's these fibrous rings around the valves for support that the muscles can attach to. And it also serves as electrical insulation between the atrium and ventricles. So that way the heart can have a beat like it's supposed to. We'll kind of go through that today also. But it provides a site for muscle attachment, those fibrous connective tissue. So cardiac muscle, we've looked at it briefly in the muscular system. But they're elongated. They're cylindrical cells, but they're branching. So they look kind of like skeletal muscle cells, but it would branch off. And they have what's special about them is they have these intercalated discs, which are specialized cell-to-cell contacts. And that allows the action potentials to move from one cell to another, and they behave as a single unit. So the muscles of the atria all contract together as one single unit. The cells of the ventricles contract as a single unit. Can I switch it? Okay, last thing today, we're going to go through the conducting system. So we have these nodes that are kind of controlling or collecting this electrical signal and then passing it on. And there's an SA node, the sinoatrial node, which is in the right atrium, and this is called the pacemaker. This is going to start the whole process and kind of control your heart rate. Yep. So if they have an artificial pacemaker, that means that it's kind of overriding this SA node. It's attached where that SA node would be. Yep, my grandpa does too. Mm-hmm. They are specialized cardiac muscle cells which generate a spontaneous action potential, so they can generate their own action potentials. And that action potential passes to the atrial cell walls into what's called the AV node. The AV node is the atrioventricular node. It's medial to the right atrioventricular valve in the lower portion of the right atrium. So it's in the medial part of the heart, right above that valve, because it's still in the atrium. The action potentials are conducted more slowly here, and it makes sure that the ventricles receive the signals contract after the atria have contract, because you don't want the atria and the ventricles to contract at the same time. So that node will make sure that it collects those electric signals so the atria can contract completely and start relaxing before the ventricles start to contract. And then the AV bundle passes through a hole in the cardiac skeleton to reach the interventricular septum. And then that bundle branches to the right and left branches, so it will go to the right and left ventricles, and then it just kind of spreads out into these little Purkinje fibers, they're called, Purkinje fibers. And they're large diameter cardiac muscles with few myofibrils, many gap junctions, so that conducts the action potential to all the ventricular muscle cells. So there's a picture of it here next. You weren't ready? Purkinje? Purkinje fibers. Yes. So if we look here, this would be the SA node right here at the top of the right atrium. It conducts the electrical potential to the atria, and it's collected then by this AV node. Here's the AV node. It passes through this AV bundle into the ventricular septum. These are the right and left branches, and then after they branch off, those are called the Purkinje fibers. So As it branches here, here's a Purkinje fiber. All these branches coming off would be Purkinje fibers.
They look like they're packed on.
Okay.
Oh, I thought we were done.
Yeah, we're looking at the whole conducting system, so how it conducts. One thing, and I don't remember if our notes actually go through it, but the left ventricle muscle wall is a lot thicker than the right. Why do you think that is?
More oxygen.
No.
What did you just say? The left ventricle is a lot bigger than the right.
Yeah. The muscular wall is a lot bigger in the left than in the right.
More muscle to pump blood out.
Because where is the blood going from the left ventricle?
It's going everywhere.
It's going to the whole body, whereas the right ventricle is pumping it where?
Just to the left atrium.
Just to the lungs, which isn't very
Force,
far.
it needs more muscle.
Needs
Right.
more
So the
muscle.
left needs more pressure to get that blood to go to the rest of our body. The right ventricle is a little smaller just because it's just going to the lungs and back. The atria don't have to have very strong muscle walls at all because where's the blood going from the atria?
To the right
Just to the ventricles, right? So they aren't going it's not going very far at all. The ventricles are doing the major portion of the pumping. So in cardiac muscle cell, the action potential is conducted from cell to cell. And then, but in skeletal muscle, the action potential is conducted along the length of a single fiber. So it kind of can go along the whole fiber. It doesn't have to go from a node or anything. In a cardiac muscle, the rate of the action potential propagation is slow because there's gap junctions and small diameter of fibers, basically just so that it can make sure the atria contracts before the ventricles contract, etc. In skeletal, it's a lot faster just because the diameter of the fibers is a lot larger. So this is what action potentials in skeletal and muscular system, skeletal and cardiac muscle look like, where the skeletal has a lot shorter depolarization phase. Cardiac muscle, you have this longer depolarization phase, and there's a plateau phase that occurs, and we'll kind of go through that. So there's actually a prepotential where there's a spontaneously developing local potential. That's what's going to make the SA node generate their action potentials. Once it gets to a certain threshold, then it's going to have the SA node will fire an action potential. Then there's a refractory period where there's an absolute refractory period where the cardiac muscle completely is insensitized to further stimulation. So if it would get more electrical impulses during this absolute refractory period, it can't have any more muscle contraction occur anyways. The relative refractory period is reduced sensitivity to additional stimulation. Long refractory periods in cardiac muscles prevent tetanic contractions. Do you guys remember what tetanus was?
Lockjaw.
Lockjaw is what you can get from tetanus, yeah. But it's where the muscle is continually contracting and it won't relax. So you don't want that to happen to your heart. That would be fatal. So when you look at electrocardiogram and an ECG, like on House or whatever you're watching, and you see those little beep, 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 beep things, we're going to look through this beep, beep. It's recording the electrical events in the myocardium that's correlated to the mechanical events. The mechanical events would be which one's actually contracting, the muscles contracting. Electrical events are just the repolarization and depolarization. So you have a couple parts of this wave. One is the P wave. That first little bump here is the depolarization of atrial myocardiums and and signals the onset of atrial contraction. So at this point right here, you're going to have the atriums contracting. Where is the blood? If the atriums are contracting, where's the blood going?
Ventricles.
Into the ventricles, right. The QRS signal is the ventricular depolarization. So it's depolarizing, relaxing, and then there's ventricular contraction. You can see this contraction of the ventricles is a lot stronger. And then the repolarization of the atria occurs at the same time. So the atria are relaxing, repolarizing at the same time that the ventricles are depolarizing and contracting.
I'm putting it away.
T wave is the repolarization of the ventricles, which is when the ventricles relax. So here's where the atria is contracting. This is where the atria relaxes, and then the ventricles contract, and the ventricles are relaxing here. They're called the PQ interval, the QT interval. There's the QRS complex, but there's the different ways they do that. Let me see what do you got here next. We can stop there.